Hello everybody, I'm Mango Thunderslice. Today we're talking about climate change, or anthropogenic global warming, or the Green New Deal, and I guess all the associated topics. In this never-ending game of whack-a-mole with the progressive liberal communist agenda, the new one that's popping up is climate change, and here we have the New York Times with an opinion article yesterday, "Time to Panic. The planet is getting warmer in catastrophic ways, and fear may be the only thing that saves us. The age of climate panic is here. Heat waves, blah blah blah, temperature going up, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's the most dire, alarming thing that could possibly be happening. The climate just changing so fast and ready to kill us all." And basically it's a long opinion article just rehashing the same old talking points, wildfires, heat waves, and temperature going up, making the point that we just all need to be deathly afraid of climate change. That's the most important thing. And we have the Green New Deal. If the recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is to be believed, humanity has just over a decade to get carbon emissions under control before catastrophic climate change impacts become unavoidable. The Republican Party generally ignores or denies that problem, but the Democratic Party claims to accept and understand it. It is odd then that the Democrats do not have a plan to address climate change. Imagine that. Obama had his American Clean Energy and Security Act passed in 2009, ended up with a whole bunch of grift and money handed out to Obama's kind of crony friends. The Solyndra scandal is one, right? They gave billions of dollars to these companies who were politically connected, and the company went belly up and all that money was gone. But the Green New Deal proposes to do that times 100. This is the Green New Deal in this long fawning article by Vox talking about the Green New Deal, concentrating solar power. These solar plants, have you ever looked these up? Birds fly across the sky, right? That's what birds tend to do. And these things basically create these giant piles of just incinerated birds. They say that this is environmentally friendly energy. It's actually just a horror show. And though Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and all of the dumb Democrats are on board, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, is not so stoked about it, probably because she knows most Americans are already a little fed up with the communist tendencies of the blue team and doesn't necessarily want it to go farther, but according to the socialist millennials, she should step aside because we're going full on into communism. All right, and there's old Pelosi. What a lovely looking woman she is. She just looks like such a nice lady. 3 core principles of the GND: decarbonization, jobs, and justice, right? The plan must decarbonize the economy. We're going to get rid of all carbon emissions altogether. We're not going to have any energy from fossil fuels, right? Ocasio-Cortez's platform calls for 100% renewable electricity within 10 years, but very few policy experts believe that is possible. Anybody who calls themselves an expert and says that that's possible is not an expert. They're a crackpot. Okay? Carlock and most other wonks in the field thinks it's preferable to shoot for 100% clean and renewable energy to make room for nuclear, right? Well, at least somebody's at least trying to be somewhat reasonable. Plan must include a federal jobs guarantee and large-scale public investments, right? Handing out more money to politically connected cronies. And the plan must include a just transition, right? 10 years is only enough to completely rebuild the entire country and replace the entire energy system. No big deal. This is the draft text of the proposed addendum to House rules for the Green New Deal. They're trying to set up a select committee for a Green New Deal. A bunch of people to just sit and talk about this thing. And here in the frequently asked questions, they're at, oh, why do we need it? Beer. Why should the government have a big role in driving and making any required investments? Why not just incentivize the private sector, for example, tax subsidies and such? 2 main reasons. 1, scale, and 2, time. First, scale. The level of investment required will be massive. Even if all the billionaires and companies came together and were willing to pour all the resources at their disposal into this investment, the aggregate value of the investments they could make would not be sufficient. For example, the $1 trillion over 10 years plan for reinvestment in the green economy that has been floated by some policymakers has been criticized by climate experts as a wholly inadequate level of investment. $1 trillion is the entire market cap of Amazon, one of the biggest companies of all time. Second is time. The speed of investment required required will be massive. Even if all the billionaires and companies could make the investments required, they would not be able to pull together a coordinated response in the narrow window of time required to jumpstart major new projects and major new sectors. And they say that incentivizing the private sector doesn't work, that the tax incentives haven't built a 100% green economy in a few short years as they think is possible and would love to have happen. Right, and here's the thing, how will the government pay for these investments? And the answer is in the same ways that we paid for the 2008 bank bailout and extended quantitative easing program. I love that that's how the first thing they go to. Like literally one of the most corrupt operations in financial history. They just leap to us, oh, we'll just do it the same way. The same ways we paid for World War II and many other wars, right? And the wars, right? That's just as good as a war. The Federal Reserve can extend credit to power these projects and investments. New public banks can be created to extend credit, and a combination of various taxation tools can be employed. So yeah, basically we're just going to print the money, and that's their great, fantastic explanation. That's just beautiful. And this, of course, is a big cult and new religion, the global warming environmental religion. Barack Obama 6 years ago came out and tweeted, 97% of scientists agree climate change is real, man-made, and dangerous. Very dangerous to those folks. You know, Barack Obama, clueless on virtually every subject, and especially this one. There is no 97% consensus. There's maybe a 52% consensus. Flip a coin, and that's astounding, especially considering the vast, hundreds of billions of dollars that's poured into climate science by the federal government. The 97% consensus quoted daily by Barack Obama is based on a few fraudulent studies of a handful of published papers. The only study which actually asked the scientists was done by the American Meteorological Society in 2013. It showed that only 52% of professional members believed the cause of global warming was mostly human. Among professional forecasters, the number was closer to 38%. No group came anywhere close to 97%. And here you have the table of survey results. All the climate models agree that warming is happening. The problem is that they're just computer models. It's like, in our computer game, it says that the warming is going to happen. Well, it doesn't matter what your computer game says. It matters what happens in real life. And if we look at the actual observations, we can see that there's basically been no global warming in the 21st century. And granted, this article was from 2013. This is talking about Dr. John Christie, professor of atmospheric science and director of the Earth Systems Science Center at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, and saying Christie's findings are contrary to predictions made by 73 computer models cited in the UN's latest IPCC fifth assessment report. Christie told CNS News that he analyzed all 73 models used in the 5AR, and not one accurately predicted that the Earth's temperature would remain flat since October 1st, 1996. All 73 models' predictions were on average 3 to 4 times what occurred in the real world. Christie pointed out the closest was a Russian model that predicted a 1-degree increase. Oh, those dastardly Russians. When CNS News asked Christie how the IPCC could claim 95% certainty that human activity is causing global warming when it failed to predict that global temperatures would remain flat over the last 17 years, he replied, I am baffled that the confidence increases when the performance of your models is conclusively failing. I cannot understand that methodology. Well, you're not the only one, Mr. Christie. The global warming cults, the proponents of the religion, will say that it never happened, and this is a funny article. They just this big headline that says it never happened. 2 new studies explain why. This article doesn't even explain anything at all. It mentions 2 papers and gives the barest inkling of an explanation. In hindsight, with current global mean surface temperature datasets, there is no statistical evidence for a pause, concluded one of the 2 studies which reassessed temperature monitoring from the late 1990s and early 2000s. Right? So it doesn't explain anything, right? It gives this graph, which may or may not even be connected to it. It's not explained at all. And then they move on. The second study, which focused on what appeared to be a difference in observed temperatures and earlier projections from climate models, reached a similar conclusion. There was a natural slowdown in the rate of warming during roughly the decade of the 2000s due to a combination of volcanic influences and internal climate variability, but there was no actual hiatus or pause in warming. Michael Mann, director of the Earth Systems Science Center at Pennsylvania State University and author of the climate modeling study, said, Michael Mann is literally the climate cultist. He's the high priest of this new religion, okay? So not exactly a corroborating source at all. They say, we had a lack of Arctic data, blah, blah, blah. They make up these, it's in the 2000s when we've got hundreds of satellites in the air, we didn't have the data from the Arctic. Okay. Then they put out this graph and they say, oh look, here's the temperature increase, and here's all the natural drivers, volcanic, solar, orbital, and here's all the human influences, greenhouse gases. So, but it can only be the greenhouse gases, right? According to these charts with all these nice little color-coded lines, right? It could not be disproven. Look at all these colors. Clearly says right there that the solar influences and nothing at all. And this is absolute nonsense, right? Moving on, is there a global warming pause? Yes, the answer is, based on 13 out of 16 data sets, right? So here you see a whole series of different data sets and the length of pause that the data sets demonstrate. Here we've got 25 years, 7 months, right? Basically all of these data sets all show a pause. And even these ones down here, the 3 that don't show a pause, it's still less than 10 years. It's just not enough to base a climate opinion. Climate is 30 years. Pause or hiatus in global warming. Despite the continued increase in atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations, the annual mean global temperature has not risen in the 21st century, challenging the prevailing view that anthropogenic forcing causes climate warming. It has been claimed that the early 2000s global warming slowdown or hiatus, characterized by a reduced rate of global surface warming, has been overstated, lacks sound scientific basis, or is unsupported by the observations. The evidence presented here contradicts these claims. So yeah, they can say that there's no pause, but the data shows that there is. So, you know, there's nothing really to argue there. And then we move on, the fiddling with the temperature data. This is basically the main proof of how to prove that global warming is pseudoscience, is basically the fiddling with the temperature data. Any conclusions you base off of fraudulent data are fraudulent conclusions. They cannot be true because you're basing it off of an assumption that itself is false. So these temperature graphs, temperature data sets that NASA and NOAA put out have been systematically altered to create the effect that they're now calling global warming. We'll get into that. So fiddling with temperature data. New data shows that the vanishing of polar ice is not the result of runaway global warming. And here's essentially the overlay of the graph between the raw data from the meteorological stations and the adjusted. You can see that in the blue line, which was the raw data, we show basically a trend showing no statistical increase in global mean temperature. And then you see the red line, which is the adjusted, clearly showing a linear trend upwards. Okay, US data since 1895 failed to show a warming trend. This was an article from 1989. After examining climate data extending back nearly 100 years, a team of government scientists has concluded that there has been no significant change in average temperatures or rainfall in the United States over that entire period. And this was a study made by scientists for National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and from NOAA themselves. So this was 30 years ago, and they showed no global warming over that previous century. And now they show that the complete opposite. They just basically contradicted their own previous conclusions. Here you see NASA 1999 versus NASA 2016. One clearly shows a peak in the 30s and a decline since then. The other, the peak in the 30s, has been systematically reduced to show a linear trend upwards to today. And so when you actually do the math of the actual corrections and adjustments over time, the final minus raw, this is what you're looking at, okay? So this is essentially the distortion that they've overlaid into that information. It looks exactly like the hockey stick, right? Here it is again, US HCN adjustment versus atmospheric CO2, and you see that they have essentially created the linear trend that they're now decrying as something that we're all supposed to be and crying ourselves to sleep about. Most of the recent data tampering has been due to simply making data up. In their monthly temperature data, they mark estimated as opposed to measured temperatures with a capital E. So far in 2019, 61% of the monthly temperature data is now estimated by a computer model, rather than actual measured thermometer data. The amount of fake data is up 500% since 30 years ago. So when I told you earlier that, oh, they're just looking at their computer game and making conclusions in real life based off of their computer game, you can see that that's absolutely true, to the degree of 61%. As time has gone on, the component of fraudulent data, of completely made up numbers, has jumped up from 12% back in the early 90s to 61% today. The more that the climate observations and measurements in real life contradict their models, the more that they jimmy the models to show a false conclusion and keep gaslighting the population and trying to lead them into global socialism. There is overwhelming evidence of fraud in NOAA and NASA's handling of climate data, and it is very important that they are held to account. Extreme fraud in the National Climate Assessment. They're saying that extreme hot weather is getting more common and cold weather more rare. And they show this graph, U.S. heat waves. Oh my goodness, look at that. At this rate, every single day will be a heat wave in 10 years, right? Another graph that just like is cherry picked just to show you, this linear trend, but it's nonsense, right? It's taken from page 38 of the 4th National Climate Assessment document released in November 2018, so just 4 months ago. U.S. heat waves, here it is again. Right? And this is the actual raw data that they're taking it from. Looks a little different when you go back beyond the 1960s, huh? Maybe doesn't support your conclusion at all that hot weather is increasing over time, right? We see the 30s were insanely hotter than they are today, like not even close, right? And this trend, the 60s was literally the bottom of the trend, right? Heat wave magnitude. I mean, how can you expect people to not call you out as being pseudoscience when you start your graph here in 1960 to convey this information? That is complete scientific fraud and unexcusable by any measure. Heat wave index here again, you see the 30s completely overshadow today. And if they were to actually represent their graph up here honestly, they would have a red bar 10 times taller over here on the left, right? But they don't because they're liars. Again, showing the hidden data and the shown. News articles from the 30s, heat wave toll claims over 12,000 in 86 cities this week. Right, and during the 30s, there was the same global warming hysteria back then. Oh my goodness, the glaciers are melting, the polar ice thaw is increasing, and world's temperature getting warmer. But the warmth of the 1930s and 1940s turned rapidly into cooling, and by the 1960s, there was unanimous consent that the Earth was cooling. Right, scientists agree, world is colder. U.S. and Soviet press studies of a colder Arctic. Weather signs suggest another ice age ahead. Geologists at case traces longer winters, sees ice age in 200 years. Scientists predict a new ice age by the 21st century, right? All these articles from the 60s and 70s predicting a new ice age only a few decades after they had predicted catastrophic runaway warming. And of course, we got into today's, times and we see them going back in the other direction. Oh my God, uncontrollable runaway warming. But it's like every time there's an anomaly or a series of anomalies over a set of years, they just jump to the conclusion that it's a runaway effect that will never stop. Fraud in the National Climate Assessment Part 2. Right, where the first part was about heat waves, this is about Arctic sea ice extent. Here again, you see they start their data in 1979 as if there was no Arctic before 1979. They'll say that that's when the satellite measurement began. That's also a lie. There were satellite measurements in the early 70s, and there were ways to measure the Arctic ice well before that. And of course, when we actually take the data before, we see that basically the ice was much, much less at certain points, and it swings just like everything else in this universe. And the ice is not going away, not at all, not even close. Here's a graph of the sea ice extent showing the rest of the data, right? They have the rest of the data, they just don't show it to you for some reason. I wonder why. Maybe because they're trying to make catastrophic runaway trend. And here you see basically the sea ice is way higher than it has been for much of the 20th century. And here's another one. Climate alarmists start their Arctic graphs here and then declare this to be a linear trend. It's funny because the global warming alarmists will say that the climate change skeptics are cherry-picking data, and that's how we come to these erroneous conclusions of disproving climate change or global warming. And then they're the ones who do this stuff right here, right? They cherry-pick this data set right here and say it's an uncontrollable runaway linear trend. Absurd. Here's some great article snapshots. Expert Arctic polar cap may disappear this summer. That was from 2008. Obviously the ice cap is still here. Could all Arctic ice be gone by 2012? Satellite images say it might be. Arctic summers ice free by 2013. Oh yeah, Gore. Okay, polar ice cap may disappear by summer 2014. Alright, article 2008. Hansen, echoing work by other scientists, said that in 5 to 10 years the Arctic will be free of ice in the summer. And they are liars. Extreme wildfire fraud in the National Climate Assessment, right? So we covered the heat waves, we covered the Arctic sea ice extent, we showed basically the systematic manipulation of the temperature data. Now let's move on to the wildfires. Here again, it's like they're one trick pony, just cherry pick the graph and show the trend you want to see, right? So they start the graph in 1980 or 1984, looks like, and oh my goodness, look at all these wildfires, so many more wildfires. But we go back and we see, oh my goodness, yeah, looks like everything was burning about 50 times more earlier in the 20th century. And again, where do they start their data? Right here, literally at the bottom of the graph. They start their data at the very, very bottom of the trend, and they don't show you this. Why would they not show you this if they were honest and they were trying to convince you of something that was real and actually happening? Here again, you see the overlay of the fraudulent graph put out by the National Climate Assessment compared to the total data set. They are liars. And there's again in red showing the data hidden by their deceptive graph. Here's a New York Times article from 1938 about all the forest fires and how much they were destroying back in the 30s. Another data set of California forest fire burn acreage showing that a linear downtrend. This is another one we can throw in the garbage bin as junk science. This is a good video by a great channel, Suspicious Observers. Basically they do a daily update on space weather, solar weather, new scientific advances, and they've made a lot of great videos about the climate. This video is top 6 climate change problems. I love how they put these Wikipedia links down here. I've got plenty of them on my video too, and I wear them like a badge of honor, showing that the Matrix and the Empire knows that I'm dealing death blows to their propaganda, and so that's great. The sources from that video, there's a ton of them here. This is a whole bunch of citations and links. Yeah, lots of great links. We're going to look through a couple of them. Global warming research suppressed due to intolerance of skepticism, claims scientists. A professor claims his paper questioning the speed of climate change was deliberately rejected for publication due to intolerance of views seen as skeptical. And this was Professor Lennart Bengtsson. He is a former director of the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg. Professor Lennart Bengtsson says recent McCarthy-style pressure from fellow academics forced him to resign from his post on a climate skeptic think tank. The problem we have now in the scientific community is that some scientists are mixing up their scientific role with that of climate activist. Professor Bengtsson claims a scientist advised that the paper, which challenged findings that global temperature would increase by 4.5 degrees Celsius if greenhouse gases were to double, should not be published in a respected journal because it was less than helpful. So if you doubt our completely absurd projections, you're less than helpful. That's great. The Global Warming Policy Foundation was founded by a former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lord Lawson, established because of concerns that government policies to combat climate change may be too radical. The think tank describes itself as open-minded on the contested science of global warming. Lord Lawson has agreed that Professor Bengtsson's references to McCarthyism were, quote, fully warranted. And here's the climate alarmist website. How does the sun affect our climate? And they'll basically say, oh, it doesn't. And basically the reason that they say it doesn't, and I've covered this in previous videos, is because they're going by TSI, also known as total solar irradiance. They measure the energy output of the sun. The problem is they're not measuring the total energy output of the sun. They're measuring the heat and the light, which is a far cry from the total energetic output of the sun, which we'll get into here in a second. This article is essentially saying that the sun is not a part of changing the climate, right? It's just genesis of the entire climate and the reason that life on Earth can even exist, but no, it doesn't have anything to do with the climate. Here's some scientific articles. The importance of geomagnetic field changes versus rising CO2 levels for the long-term change in the upper atmosphere. Here's from the abstract. The Earth's upper atmosphere has shown signs of cooling and contraction over the past decades. This is generally attributed to increasing levels of atmospheric CO2, a coolant in the upper atmosphere. However, especially the charged part of the upper atmosphere, the ionosphere, also responds to the Earth's magnetic field, which has been weakening considerably over the past century, as well as changing its structure. Relative importance of the changing geomagnetic field compared to enhanced CO2 levels for long-term change in the upper atmosphere is still a matter of debate. Oh, I thought it was settled science. Here we present a quantitative comparison of the effects of the increase in CO2 concentration and changes in the magnetic field from 1908 to 2008 based on simulations. Here's another one, focus. Simulations strengthen Earth's magnetic field climate connection. And yes, I don't really like computer models more than raw data, but they can be useful. It's just that they have to be married to reality and checked against reality. A computer model that never gets checked against reality, like the climate models, is less than useless. Simulations support the idea that during past ice ages, slightly faster rotation rate for the Earth could have increased its magnetic field. So, right, there's these long-term cycles in the Earth's climate, and they are very much related to the spin of the Earth, the relation of the Earth to the Sun, obliquity rates. All of these things play long-term roles in that modulation of the climate signal, right? Everything's going up and it's going down. A lot of times it goes way up and it goes way down. But what we don't see at any point in history is basically a runaway climate system where one little indice will basically run away and it'll never stop. This planet wouldn't have made it this far if it was a high feedback system like that just ran away, right? It's a self-correcting system. It's not something that just explodes, right? It's something that self-corrects at a certain point. It's built into the system. Rock samples show that variations in Earth's magnetic field over tens to hundreds of thousands of years are roughly synchronized with the ice ages. They talk about the magnetospheres, and they're basically saying that the magnetic field of the Earth correlates very well with previous ice ages, right? And that's not saying the total climate, but it is at least more evidence that they're affiliated with the ice ages. Changes in the Earth's magnetic field over the past century, effects on the ionosphere, thermosphere system, and solar quiet magnetic variation. And here's the abstract. We investigated the contribution of changes in the Earth's magnetic field to long-term trends in the ionosphere, thermosphere, and solar quiet magnetic variation. Simulations with the magnetic fields of 1908, 1958, and 2008 were done. Changes in electron density resulted in changes in electron temperature of the opposite sign, which in turn produced small corresponding changes in ion temperature. The simulated Atlantic region trends in these manner are similar to 2.5 times larger than the estimated effect of enhanced greenhouse gases. The secular variation of Earth's magnetic field may therefore be the dominant cause of trends in the Atlantic region ionosphere. Okay, pretty clear that when they dive into it, they find that the magnetic field of the planet is far more, at least the same, but possibly far more influential on the climate than carbon dioxide, a trace gas. And here's getting back into the total solar irradiance, right? Evaluation of errors made in solar irradiance estimation due to averaging of the angstrom turbidity coefficient. This is essentially saying that by averaging the energy output of the sun over large chunks of time, they've basically created a graph in their model that is not attached to reality, and that the errors are as large as 20%, exceeding 20%, because of their ineffective averaging of these numbers, right? So that TSI that they're basing everything on when they say, oh, the sun doesn't determine the climate, they're using TSI, and TSI is a joke. It has errors exceeding 20%, and they're saying this is settled science. And here we see basically sunspot number over time, over the last basically 10,000 years. And we see that in the latter part of the 20th century, we saw an increase in sunspots that hasn't been seen for 7,000 years or more. Right? We saw in the later part of the 20th century an extremely active sun, a lot of emissions, a lot of sunspots, a lot of charged particles coming into the planet and heating up the ionosphere of the Earth, as we just saw in the previous articles. We saw that energy come into the Earth system and raise the temperature. So the sun was the leading indicator. It wasn't immediate. There's a lag time. But the reason that the planet heated up on average in the late 20th century is because of the increased sun activity. And this graph shows that pretty clearly, that what we experienced was greater than anything in at least 5-6 millennia. And so if that's the leading indicator, where are we going from here? Solar activity heads for lowest low in 4 centuries. The sun's activity is in free fall, according to a leading space physicist. But don't expect a little ice age. Solar activity is declining very fast at the moment. Mike Lockwood, professor of space environmental physics at Reading University, UK, told New Scientist, "We estimate faster than at any time in the last 9,300 years." Lockwood and his colleagues are reassessing the chances of this decline continuing over decades to become the first grand solar minimum for 4 centuries. During a grand minimum, the normal 11-year solar cycle is suppressed and the sun has virtually no sunspots for several decades. This summer should have seen a peak in the number of sunspots, but it didn't happen. All right, and this was also from 2013, but we have seen that solar quiet continue, and there are virtually no sunspots on the sun today. It is extremely quiet in that regard. Lockwood thinks there is now a 25% chance of a repetition of the last grand minimum, the late 17th century Maunder minimum, when there were no sunspots for 70 years. The Maunder minimum coincided with the worst European winters of the Little Ice Age, a period lasting centuries when several regions around the globe experienced unusual cooling. Tree ring studies suggest it cooled the northern hemisphere by up to 0.4 degrees Celsius. right? And the new solar model of the climate is definitely advancing, and there are more scientists, very, very highly accredited scientists, who are getting on and looking at this and understanding that this is the real connection. And this is a series of articles by this guy, Dr. David Evans, an electrical engineer and mathematician who earned 6 university degrees over 10 years, including a PhD from Stanford University in electrical engineering, digital signal processing. David has worked in the climate industry consulting full-time for the Australian Greenhouse Office from 1999 to 2005 and part-time for the Department of Climate Change from 2008 to 2010. He was the lead modeler analyzing the carbon in Australia's biosphere for Kyoto accounting purposes and developed the world-leading carbon accounting model FullCam that Australia uses in the land use change and forestry sector. For the last 18 months, David pursued an idea and developed something the climate debate has needed but failed to achieve after 30 years despite billions of dollars in funding. He's taken sophisticated silicon chip maths and applied it to the climate system, analyzing the system as a black box to discover the filters and parts. He has built a working OD model with 15,000 lines of code. Historically, this is how real science is done. One well-trained, passionate researcher pursues a creative idea that breaks the current paradigm and then sets the theory free for everyone to test and review. This work, should it stand the test of time, will be held up as an example of where independent research can succeed over the grand failure of expensive government-funded and bureaucratically driven science. Skipping ahead to one of the later articles here, basically new solar theory predicts imminent global cooling. To recap, using an optimal Fourier transform, David Evans discovered a form of Knotch filter operating between changes in sunlight and temperatures on Earth. This means there must be a delay, probably around 11 years. This not only fitted with the length of the solar dynamo cycle, but also with previous independent work suggesting a lag of 10 years or a correlation with the solar activity of the previous cycle. The synopsis then is that solar radiance, TSI, is a leading indicator of some other effect coming from the sun after a delay of 11 years or so. The discovery of this delay is a major clue about the direction of our future climate. The flickers in sunlight run a whole sunspot cycle ahead of some other force from the sun. Knowing that solar radiance dropped suddenly from 2003 onwards tells us the rough timing of the fall in temperature that's coming. Just add a solar cycle length. What it doesn't tell us is the amplitude, the size of the fall. That's where the model may or may not tell us what we want to know. That test is coming, and very soon. This is an unusual time in the last 100 years where the forecasts from the CO2-driven models and the solar model diverge sharply. Oh, the timing. Ponder how ambitious this simple model is. The complex global climate models only aim to predict decadal trends and have failed to do even that. Here is a smaller, simpler model proffering up a prediction which is so much more specific. The solar model has not shown skill yet in predictions on such short time scales, though it hindcasts reasonably well on the turning points and longer scales. It cannot predict ENSO events and obviously not aerosols nor volcanoes, but if the Knotch delay theory is right, the big drop coming is larger than the short-term noise. As global bureaucracy beckons, a sharp cooling change appears to be developing and set to hit in the next 5 years. Yet consortia of five-star politicians are not preparing for climate change, only for global warming. Around the world, $1 billion a day is invested in renewable energy, largely with the hope of changing the weather. Given that 20% of the world does not even have access to electricity, history books may marvel at how screwed priorities were and how bureaucratized science cost so much more than the price of the grants. If the sun mainly controls the temperature on Earth, a turning point is almost upon us. In the second part of this series of blog posts, we demonstrated that carbon dioxide is responsible for less than 25% of the global warming in the last 6 decades, so presumably the sun is mainly responsible. Number 1, why it's going to cool. The reason for the cooling is the dramatic fall in total solar irradiation that started about 2004. Here is a graph of solar radiation since 1610 when sunspots were first recorded. The brown line is the solar radiation and it peaks every 11 years or so because of the sunspot cycle. We put an 11-year smoother through it to give us the red line, which shows the trends in solar radiation. And here you can see basically a steady increase, especially over the 20th century, as we noted before, a massive increase in the level of solar activity, which correlated with an increase in global mean temperature. What we are seeing now is a sharp drop-off in that same radiation from the sun, indicating that if this is the true leading indicator, we should see a cooling in temperature and not a continual warming as the carbon model predicts. There have been 3 big steep falls in solar radiation in the last 400 years. The first was the 1600s. It led to the depths of the Little Ice Age and the Maunder Minimum. This was the coldest period during the last 400 years. There used to be fairs on the ice on the Thames River in London because it would freeze over for weeks at a time. The second fall is around the time of Napoleon, and it preceded the second coldest period in 400 years, called the Dalton Minimum. The third fall occurred recently, starting about 2004. The recent fall is as big as the fall in Napoleon's time, almost as large as the fall in the 1600s, and it seems to be steeper than either of those falls. But the temperature hasn't fallen yet. And here we can look back at the graph and we see that the depth of the solar minimum in the last cycle is down to the levels seen during the Dalton minimum during the Napoleonic years. Number 2, when. The timing for the cooling is indicated by the delay, which was deduced from the observed Knotch, but is independently corroborated to varying extents several times in the last decade. The delay is most likely 11 years, though definitely between 10 and 20 years. So 11 years plus 2004 is 2015. Suggesting that the cooling will start in 2015. However, 11 years is only the average delay, and the physical interpretation of the delay suggests the delay is actually the length of the solar cycle, which has varied from 8 to 14 years, but averages 11. The current solar cycle is a long one, probably running about 13 years, so 13 plus 2004 is 2017. So the cooling is most likely to begin in 2017. An El Niño or La Niña could affect the timing too. At this stage we don't know, but by the end of 2018 seems fairly likely. And 2016 was another El Niño event, so we did have a seasonably high spike in the global mean temperature, and that is totally a part of the climate system. It does not indicate any further expansion upward, but of course in their alarmist articles they'll say, oh my god, warmest ever. But it's not true. The average trend over the 21st century is cooling, and actually through the 20th into the 21st shows cooling. And of course, we had a nice snow this morning. We've had tons of precipitation. We've had plenty of snow. I didn't expect to get snow at this elevation living here in the Sierra Nevadas. We got it in Reno because that's the high desert. But yeah, things are changing, and it's not all about warming. And this winter we have seen a lot of extremely cold weather. We saw basically temperatures in the Great Lakes area that were literally colder than Antarctica. Granted, at this time of year, Antarctica is in its warmer time because it's the southern hemisphere, but still, Antarctica was warmer than Michigan, and they want to say it's global warming, right? Here we see places that broke cold records in 2018, and this was back in October, and it didn't get much warmer after that, so I'm sure a few more were broken. Right? Look at this cold. Insane. And this is why they have to keep pressing the global warming thing, because they know that people, they look outside and they see 10 feet of snow, and they're like, oh, where's my global warming? Please let the global warming come. We wish the globe would warm, because it's so freaking cold. 3. How much cooling? How much cooling and how quickly? For that we turn to the Knotch delay solar model, which hindcasts the last 240 years of temperatures reasonably well from the total solar irradiance. This model was developed earlier in the series of blog posts. The changes in solar radiation are tiny and have an almost insignificant immediate effect on Earth's temperatures. However, the physical interpretation of the Knotch and delay shows that these little changes foretell the changes in a newly detected climate influence from the Sun, which we are calling Force X for now. The effect on temperatures of changes in Force X is 10 to 20 times as great as the immediate effect of changes in solar radiation. Force X works by modulating the albedo of the Earth, or the amount of solar radiation reflected back out into space without changing the heat of the planet by clouds and ice and so on. Force X turns the tap that controls how much sunlight pours into the Earth's climate system. This could be through UV, magnetic field effects, solar wind, or some form of electrical field. Force X lags TSI by half of a full solar cycle of 22 years, which is to say by 11 years on average. Therefore, the changes in solar radiation over the last 11 years tell us what Force X is going to do soon. It's already baked into the cake. We can see a few years into the future. And here we can see that basically the solar climate model matches very well with the observed temperature changes over the last 100 years. If temperature on Earth is entirely controlled by solar effects, the cooling will return us to temperature levels of the 1950s or even the 1920s, undoing the last 50 or 100 years of global warming in just a few short years. Number 4, solar versus carbon dioxide. Both the carbon dioxide and the Knotch delay solar theories agree with the warming observed during the 1900s because carbon dioxide levels and solar radiation levels were both generally rising. So we cannot tell the models apart on recent performance. However, over the next 10 years, the theories strongly diverge. Carbon dioxide levels will continue to rise at much the same rate, so the carbon dioxide models predict warming over the next decade of about 0.2 degrees Celsius, plus up to 0.3 degrees Celsius of previously committed warming not reflected in the temperature pause of the last 15 plus years. Owing to the fall in solar radiation from about 2004 and making allowance for rising carbon dioxide, the Knotch delay solar model predicts cooling of 0.2 degrees Celsius or more. Here you can see in the graph the green line showing the hockey stick that's all over the mainstream media today, and the solar model based on irradiation from the sun showing that we should be entering a cooling period. Number 5, theories and falsifiability. Science is about testable hypotheses. Over the next decade, the changes in temperature will reveal which theory is more correct, the carbon dioxide model or the Knotch delay solar model. Here's the criterion. A fall of at least 0.1 degrees Celsius on a one-year smooth basis in global average surface air temperature over the next decade. If the criterion does not occur, then the Knotch delay solar model is falsified and it should be thrown away. If the criterion does occur, then the carbon dioxide-driven models are falsified and they should be thrown away. Note that the carbon dioxide theory predicts only warming over longer periods such as a decade, and we've already had a pause in warming for over 15 years. Number 6, old temperatures. The Maunder minimum from about 1645 to 1715 and the Dalton period from about 1790 to 1830 are generally reckoned to be the two coldest times in the last 400 years. There was no global thermometer network before 1850, so for a global picture we have to rely on proxy data. Ice cores, pollen, marine sediments, lake sediments, tree rings, etc. The most comprehensive study is Christensen and Lundqvist's huge proxy study in 2012, which used 91 proxies scattered around the world. We smoothed it by 25 years in Figure 1 because proxy data is uncertain and hazy. Even the IPCC thought those two periods were the coldest in the last 400 years before they went all hockey stick. And you can see the first assessment of the IPCC still acknowledged the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age. And then they went to the second assessment and they completely erased it. So now we have the new graph. Basically, it's been totally erased just to support their theory. It's absolute joke and it's pretending to be science. Even the models used by the climate scientists are now starting to include the solar forcing aspects of the sun into the climate model. This paper is about what they're recommending for it, not just total solar irradiance, but solar spectral irradiance, right? The magnetic field fluctuations, particle forcing, right? Charged particle emissions, geomagnetic indices AP and KP, ionization rates to account for effects of solar protons, electrons, and galactic cosmic rays. This is the first time that a recommendation for solar-driven particle forcing has been provided for a CMIP exercise. And that is the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, and now it's going into its 6th iteration. This is still recent enough that we won't have seen any of the new conclusions or data analysis from this, but over the next couple years we will be seeing that come out, and I predict that as they factor in more of the real solar indices, the changes in the sun's solar polar magnetic fields and their flips and that whole signal into the system that they're modeling, they're going to find that the solar influence is much greater than the carbon dioxide. And when they actually bring this model back down to reality, they're going to find that the hockey stick, doomsday, fear porn mentality just goes out the window and is revealed as pseudoscience. And the CMIP is by the World Climate Research Program, right, established by the International Science Council, the World Meteorological Organization, the main guys of climate modelers. Here's a video, Nobel laureate in physics, global warming is pseudoscience. Ivar Giavar, a Nobel laureate in physics, basically talking about the pseudoscience of man-made global warming through CO2. Of course, even if carbon dioxide runs away and we just keep burning oil and fossil fuels, the climate is not a runaway system, and the biosphere loves carbon dioxide. It's plant food. You know, I work in the cannabis industry. We pump CO2 into those grow rooms up to, 1,000 ppm, 1,500 ppm to make the plants grow faster. More CO2 increases the metabolic rate of the plants, and they grow faster, taking more carbon out of the air. Here we see an article from The Guardian, 1/5 of world carbon emissions soaked up by extra forest growth, scientists find. Simon Lewis, a climate expert at the University of Leeds who led the study, said, "We are receiving a free subsidy from nature. Tropical forest trees are absorbing about 18% of the carbon dioxide added to the atmosphere each year from burning fossil fuels, substantially buffering the rate of change." Here we see the total biomass of life forms on Earth. right? Plants, and a circle this size is 10 gigatons, right? There's the soil fungi, soil bacteria, and far more than tropical forest trees, algae in the ocean is the greatest producer of oxygen and the greatest consumer of carbon dioxide. So as the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere increases, we're going to see more of it uptaken by the forest tropical trees. We're going to see more of it uptaken by the algae. We're going to see more forests growing. Right, the significance of forest and algae and CO2 balance, a Hungarian case study. This study presents the sequestration and emissions of forests and algae related to CO2 while providing a comparison to other biomass sources, such as arable crops. The goal of the paper is to analyze the impact of the current CO2 balance of forests and the future prospects for algae. It was concluded that the CO2 sequestration and natural gas saving of forests is typically 3.78 times higher than the emissions resulting from the production technology and from the burning process. So basically, as long as we stop cutting down the old growth forests and we don't take all the algae out of the ocean, any increase in CO2 is going to be buffered by the biomass on this planet and absorbed as plant food. And this is the truth of it, is that humans are tasked to be the gardeners and stewards of the planet. I very much agree with the original ethos of environmentalism, of not basically destroying the old growth forest, not polluting our planet, not pouring toxic chemicals into the ground and into our water supply, not belching toxic things into the air and poisoning people, not putting it into the food supply, right? But working with the natural force of this planet to harvest this great, farm that is the earth itself, and to bring that joy and prosperity out of it. And one of the ways we do that is with cheap energy from fossil fuels. We shouldn't plan on using them indefinitely and to maximum usage rates, because again, it's economics. We don't want to waste the resources that we have, even if we're not even thinking about the environment. We want to conserve our resources so that we're not put in a position where we don't have the resources that we need to survive. And if we go forward with the Green New Deal, that's exactly the position that we're going to be putting ourselves in, preparing for the inexorable conclusion of global warming, not even considering that climate change could go both ways. Maybe it's not just heat, maybe it's cold, maybe it's precipitation changes that leads to droughts in California that wipe out the entire food production. We got to be preparing for all the different climate change variabilities, right? And that, if we actually look honestly, intellectually at the climate model, it's impossible for me to conclude that the CO2 level is the dominant driving control knob for the climate. It just doesn't make sense. It's not backed up by the data. The amount of deception that these agencies use to convince you that that's true indicates that they're lying for an ulterior motive, for a political motive, to induce and bring forward their own policies of global socialism that nobody really wants, and that's why you have to scare the shit out of them to get them to accept it. But the truth is, this planet is in line with the creator of the universe, and as long as we just remember that we are part of nature and that we are here basically as, to learn and to interact and to adventure in this planet, it's all going to be okay. And people shouldn't be, have this anxiety and fear about the climate, because it's all just a big smokescreen put out by people who just want to scare you so that they can control you, right? You need to lose that fear and look intellectually, honestly at the data, and you'll see that the sun is the driver of all climate on Earth, all life on Earth. And if we want to know where things are going from here, it's to the sun we should be looking. So that's my video today. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.
Ah.